Hey guys, Willie Creamin back here. We are going to do a Willie Creamin Guillotinen episode today. And the reason I'm going to do this is I've had a lot of people reach out to me and ask me about this Guillotine League that I run and basically how it works, tons of questions about it and stuff. So I wanted to be able to have an episode today where we break down what it is. We talk about how you go ahead and draft in Guillotine Leagues because it is something that's kind of new for fantasy football and not as popular as maybe the PPR leagues or your Superflex leagues or Best Ball or any of those. It's something very different. So I wanted to be able to have an episode today where we break it down, cover some good stuff, and give you some good information. All right. So the first thing is, what is a guillotine league? Now, it's a new and innovative way to experience fantasy football. Now, there's typically 18 teams in a guillotine league, but it also depends on your league and how you run it, or how the commissioner runs it. So, in mine, it's drafted like your typical redraft leagues, which is snake style, right? So we go 1 to 18, 18 to 1, back from 1 to 18 again. After the first week, the lowest scoring team is removed from the league and they get chopped. And that's basically where the word guillotine comes from, right? That's how it gets its play in the league, right? Their players, once their team is chopped, their players hit the waiver wire, and then teams can lobby or bid on them to add them to their roster. So each week, the lowest scoring team gets cut, and then it's rinse and repeat until you get to the playoffs, right? So it's exciting, it's riveting, and it's definitely a nail biting way to be able to experience football, something that's very different. I'm going into my 19th year playing fantasy football, and this is my second year doing guillotine. I'll tell you, it's one of the most addicting things that you can experience when it comes to fantasy football. All right, so like I mentioned, the chopping continues all through the season until you get to the playoffs. Now, playoffs is when something different happens. Playoffs, yeah, that's right. Playoffs is when something different happens because it depends on how your commissioner has your league structured. Some leagues may go down to the final team, meaning that in week 17, with the last two teams, if you score the highest amount of points, you win the league. That's a true guillotine league. But I've put a little twist on my leagues where it comes down to four teams from week 15 to 17. The winner is the highest scoring team over that 3 week period. So, who is a guillotine league for? It's a perfect league for work groups, friend groups, or that in law that you dislike. The competitiveness is just at a whole other level than typical fantasy because you're literally sitting there every week wondering, like, oh my God, who's going to be the team that's going to get cut this week? It's more addicting than any other fantasy football league that I've played in for the last 19 years. It's so much fun. And like I said, you can have fun relishing in people's defeats, also near misses. Like there was a few times that I was wiping sweat off my neck as I'm sitting there wondering, like, oh my God, is it this week that I'm gonna get chopped? So it gets a little intense, a little crazy, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat. And there's nothing quite like going to bed feeling safe and then waking up and realizing, like, oh no, I was chopped. So anyone else who it might be for? Investors? Possibly you. All right. So some of the questions that I fielded about this. Don't I draft the same way that I do in my home league? Well, I mean, fuck no, you don't, as a matter of fact. If you do that, good luck. Like, I'm going to enjoy stealing your players from you. But you will see many people try that strategy and treat it like a typical redraft league, regardless of what it is, whether it's half PPR, Superflex, they try to treat it the same way. But it's just, there's one large and extremely vital component that you need to consider when playing in a guillotine league, and that is bye weeks. Bye weeks matter more so than any other league that I've played in. They really, really matter when it comes to drafting in guillotine. Most of the time, you're not going to have that error or that concern in redraft leagues like your typical home leagues, right? Because unless you draft like your whole, like you have 4 or 5 guys on week 6 on a bye, which you're a dumbass if you did that. But here's your sign. Like that's not something you would typically do even in a redraft league. But in guillotine, it is pivotal that your players don't share the same bye week because that could be your ticket home on any given week. So one of the questions, how to draft in a guillotine league. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. I'm not saying mine's the right way, but this is the stuff that I've had success with, and the things that I've tried out that have worked for me. So similar to redraft leagues, you need to be able to recognize trends. Who's falling, who's being overdrafted. You need to be able to recognize where the value is in the draft. Guys that are falling that you need to snag, perfect. If you're good in your own leagues, being able to recognize the value in each round and who those players are, you should have a good chance or a good opportunity to succeed in guillotine leagues. Who should you target? Anyone with high volume and high consistency. And what that means for me is wide receivers that get 8+ targets a game, running backs who consistently get 20+ touches a week, quarterbacks who are essential to their team's total point score. These are guys like Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen. Great pick. We're going to find out if those are actually great picks going forward here. A few more things on how to draft. You need to be able to understand the scoring system in your league. That's what I encourage you to do. Now, most are pretty standard. If you're using ESPN or Yahoo or Sleeper, most of the settings are pretty standard across the board. But I encourage you, before you even draft, go in and take a look at that, because you want to make sure that you understand the point values for each position. Is it 1 point per reception? Is it a half point? Is it no point? Are passing touchdowns for quarterbacks 4 points? Are they 5 points? Are they 6 points? Like, those things matter when looking at how to be able to draft for any league, let alone guillotine. You should also consider the people playing with you, how experienced they are. Do you know their tendencies? Do they like certain players? Are they fans of certain teams? Those are things that matter as well when drafting for guillotine. As I mentioned earlier, bye weeks matter. We're going to break that down a little bit here in a second. Now, obviously, you don't want to pass up on a guy like Patrick Mahomes or Jalen Hurts, right? Because these guys are essential to their team's point total. And Willie, you told us just now that if a quarterback is essential and puts up points like that, and they're going to increase their team's point total, then I need to take them, right? Well, sometimes. Let me explain how. So, these guys are both solid producers for their team. There's no question about that. Both possible MVP candidates. But you need to keep in mind that there's 17 other teams drafting against you in this draft. And if you have to sit Hurts in week 5, are you going to be able to find another quarterback to be able to sub in for him that can get you that same type of point total while he's on bye? That's going to be very difficult to do. Conversely, you could select a quarterback late in the draft and pair that with him. But just keep in mind that if other people are planning on doing that too, you're looking at 36 possible quarterbacks being drafted, and there's only 32 teams in the NFL. So chances are you're not going to find someone on the waiver wire that's going to be a starting quarterback when he's sitting in week 5. There's a reason that he goes in the 2nd or 3rd round in redrafts. It's because he's very good. You're going to have a hard time finding a guy in the 15th round or 14th round that you can pair with him. It's very difficult to do. All right, so let's take a look at these bye weeks, because you hear Willie talking, oh, bye week this, bye week that, but let's take a look at them and see what we've got, right? So week 5, we've got Detroit, Philly, Tennessee, and the Chargers. Let's take a look at week 6 too. Kansas City, the Rams, Miami, Minnesota. I'm looking at those teams right now, and there's all sorts of 1st and 2nd round talent players. Puka Nacua, Kyron Williams, Justin Jefferson, Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Hurts, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs. Do I need to continue? Right, guys? Like, come on. There's a ton of guys that are top players in the NFL that are going to go high up in the draft that belong to these teams. But can your team survive if you have Amon-Ra on your team and you have to sit him in week 5? Are you going to be able to survive getting cut? Maybe you'll get lucky, but what if you don't? In guillotine, it's not about high performance. It's about making sure that you stay above the water every single week. Conversely, you look at some of the teams towards the end. Week 12, you've got Atlanta, Buffalo, Cincinnati, New Orleans, the Jets, Jacksonville. Look at some of the guys that play for those teams, right? Bijan Robinson, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, right? And that's just a few. Garrett Wilson's in there as well. Travis Etienne. Like, there's Breece Hall. There's another one. Tons of guys that have week 12 buys. That's just week 12. I think that's a much safer bet taking one of those guys because the pool of players that will be available by the time they come up for buy is going to be much better than looking at the guys at the beginning. When you have to find a guy as a replacement in week 5 and there's only been 4 weeks of cuts, you will have had to spend a lot of your fab to be able to make that happen and make your team strong during that time. Now, if that's what you want to do, have at it. But I'm telling you, that's probably not going to be the best plan. Now, make sure you don't hear what I'm not saying here. Having a guy like Amon-Ra or Mahomes or Tyreek Hill is awesome. But again, removing a guy like that from your lineup in week 5 or week 6 is catastrophic to your team. There's no questions about it. It could absolutely send you home early. All right, some Guillotine League tips for you. Listen, you don't need to abide by the buy method the entire draft. Like, oh, Willie said don't draft a guy with a week 5 buy, right? You don't have to do that for the whole draft. You can have one of those guys, but just make sure they're not your studs, your horses, your dogs. Those are the guys that you don't want with early buys. You draft a guy in the 9th round with a week 5 buy, awesome. Chances are he's probably not going to be a starter for you, but that's okay. It's okay to do that there. But make sure in your first 2-3 picks, even your first 4, try to avoid those guys because they're very risky. Also, you don't want to stack players from the same team unless it's after week 8. Why? Well, I mean, first, you don't want to get chopped. That's the obvious reason. But also keep in mind that there will be top talent for you to be able to add to your team right after the first week. The first team gets chopped, their players hit the waiver wire. That means a 1st round pick, a 2nd round pick, a 3rd round pick, right? Chances are those 3 guys are going to be the most lucrative that people are going to go after. Also, you're going to have a much larger pool by the time week 9, 10, 11, 12, and 14 roll around. Those are the bye weeks, by the way. So when your guys are on bye, your Christian McCaffreys or, Bijan Robinsons or your Breece Halls, you're going to have other studs, other horses, maybe not their caliber, but something more comparable to be able to plug and play at that point when you're only competing against 7 or 8 teams at that point. It makes a big difference. Even with that being said, I don't think it's good practice to stack guys with week 9 bye week. It's just bad practice going through it, and you're asking for punishment. All right, so some common misconceptions when it comes to guillotine. Strength of schedule matters. Well, kind of. It plays a role. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't, but it's not a defining factor. And how many times have we seen this in the NFL in the last few years? Teams that are very good get off to a hot start in September, end up being dog shit by November or even October, or vice versa. Teams that started off very slow and were bad all of a sudden become great in November. Injuries happen. All sorts of different things happen. So basing a player off of who they're playing in December, just not the best way to go about it. Another common misconception that comes up: spend all your fab early. Fab is your free agent acquisition budget. This is your means for being able to acquire players that get cut from other teams. And usually, let me say this slowly for those with PhDs in the room so you can understand. You usually get about $100 for a fab budget at the beginning of the year. You spend some of that fab budget on players that get cut from other teams. And those players, if you win, if your fab is the highest for that bid, that player becomes your player. The point is you want to have some left in later weeks, but don't be too cautious. You need to find that perfect balance. Listen, if you get cut from the league, it doesn't matter how much fab you had. It's not going to help you at that point. Another common misconception we have is kickers and defenses don't matter. And this is laughable to me because we've all been in a league before where a kicker has popped off and scored like 20 points. And you're like sitting there like, oh man, they kicked 5-6 field goals. How did I lose to a kicker? This sucks. But I'm telling you, playing with kickers and defenses creates a volatility that you have not experienced in Guillotine. One week you could be saved. The next you could be sent home because of that. So you have to take them seriously. They do matter. So some things that I'm avoiding in Guillotine League this year. Listen, teammates, this isn't best ball, guys. Like, don't stack team. You don't get any points for that. And if they have a pretty bad week, you're going to pretty surely be going home. Like, that's not fun because you wanted to sit out there and stack Burrow and Chase, and all of a sudden they got off to a slow start like they have every year. And then you're sitting there wondering why you're not playing fantasy football anymore. That's not a good feeling. Another thing I'm avoiding is often injured players. Sorry, boys, I just don't touch injuries at all. An example last year, Cooper Kupp. I drafted him in the first round in one of my redraft leagues, thinking like, oh, it's Cooper Kupp, it's a hamstring, but it's Cooper Kupp, right? Like, he's coming back. And this was him coming off the Triple Crown year. So I figured, oh, yeah, this guy is sure bet like he's going to be a stud. And he was for most of last year, but he didn't start playing until week 5. And that's awful. By then, you are already gone. A guy that you spent a first round pick on in Guillotine, you're done at that point. It's over for you. So, another thing is rookies. Now, this year's a little bit intriguing because you've got Marvin Harrison Jr., you've got Malik Neighbors, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, right? Like, these guys are hyped up rookies that we haven't quite seen in the past. And there's big expectations that follow them because each one of them are going to play pivotal roles on their team, especially their offense. But we truly just don't know with rookies, like how they're going to do, right? They look great in preseason. That's awesome. They're playing against second and third string guys, but how do they look when they're manned up against the number one guy, or Caleb Williams has Micah Parsons rushing him? How is he going to look out there? Is he going to look like he did in preseason? Those are things that you need to consider. I'm also careful with guys on new teams. Stephon Diggs, I'm looking at you, bro. So how do you piece together the best team in Guillotine? Now, each week, team gets cut. Hopefully it's not you. But there's a few things you need to focus on. The first thing to consider is there are more wide receivers that hit the pool each week than running backs, tight ends, or quarterback, because you have more wide receiver positions on your roster. So more inherently are going to hit the waiver wire. So also spend your fab wisely. When do you splurge? Is it a player that shows consistency like we talked about and has high upside, big breakout potential? Then yes. When do you hoard your fab? Well, look at the other teams. Where are they strong? Where are they weak? What kind of fab budget do they have left? All right, guys, some last thoughts. So now listen, you can go from having a very rough and underperforming team to a solid lineup in the matter of weeks. But you need to be able to be smart about it and a little bit sly and crafty the way you put together the roster throughout the season, right? Because it's not over after the draft. You need to be able to constantly be refining and pruning your roster and looking for guys that, oh, okay, well, I see that I know I'm not going to get cut this week. It looks like the 3 teams that are going to get cut. Are there any guys on those rosters that could immediately upgrade my team that I need? That's the way you got to kind of think of things. You also want to be able to see where you can box your opponents out of picking up guys. It's a very tough balance to strike, and it takes experience to kind of understand that. You will get better the more you do it. But you need to be able to figure out the difference between spending too much or too little on guys. You may miss out on some of the guys you want. You may find out that when they post, you ended up bidding way more than you needed to on one guy, and you dropped all of your fab on one guy, and then you're stuck the rest of the year. That's not a position you want to be in. For instance, last year, I was able to box my opponents out basically the last 6 weeks of the season, because by that point, I had hoarded my fab. I had a pretty good roster to be able to begin with. Keenan Allen, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Those were 2 guys that I had. I had Raheem Mostert, Alvin Kamara, Jalen Hurts. These were guys that were very good for me, so I didn't need to upgrade those positions right away. They were consistent weekly performers for me. And then when it came time to look at the guys like a Travis Kelce or a Patrick Mahomes or a Tyreek Hill when they became available, I was able to box my opponents out from them and add them to my roster. All right, guys, that wraps it up for today. If you have any questions, concerns, anything like that, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's something you disagree with or if you think I'm right on track with it. But definitely one thing, make sure you get yourself into a Guillotine League this year. You'll be thanking me later for it. I'll be bringing you Guillotine content every single week during the season, and hopefully you're the last one standing in your league. If you like this content, go ahead and make sure that you like the video, hit that subscribe button. You can also find me on Twitch on Sundays, an hour before kickoff for the 1 p.m. games. Best of luck this season, guys. Keep that fantasy bus rolling.